All right, good morning. We're coming to the middle to the end of the year, 25-26. We have two more art lectures today, and in 2 weeks we have Ralph Puget, who's a visual artist, coming up from Portland, who will be a delight, interesting artist, of course. And today we have Miranda Mellis, and we had Arun, we've had Stephen, I spoke. It's really nice to have faculty come in and kind of share what we do outside of teaching. I think that's a really nice thing, so it's really lovely to have you here today. We are going to have Lincoln, I gotta get your last name, Hartman Jones, is that right? Jones Hartman, to introduce Miranda Mellis.
Okay, I have something written, and I'm gonna preface this by saying that I'm not a public speaker, and I actually hate it so much. But even more than my hatred of public speaking, like even greater is my admiration for Miranda Mellis. So I said, okay, I'll do it. So this is my third year at Evergreen, and I'm primarily a literary arts student, but I've kind of jumped all over. And I've had the privilege of being Miranda's student like a good handful of times. And from my experience, I can say that she's truly a master of her craft. Her dedication to the literary arts is evident just from speaking to her, taking one of her classes, or even like Googling her and seeing all of her publications. Among these are her recent novel, Crocosmia, her novellas, The Revisionist, The Spokes, and The Quarry, and her short story collection, None of This Is Real, and also several other works that are, just as highly regarded. As a writer, Miranda has held numerous artist-in-residence positions and been awarded both the John Hawkes Prize in Fiction and the Michael S. Harper Praxis Prize from Brown University's Literary Arts grad program. Miranda's work is transcendent, philosophical, and deeply political. Her writing is extremely contemplative, vaguely experimental, artfully crafted, and beautifully poetic. It is at once both mystifying and clarifying. She draws from very multidisciplinary sources of inspiration and material. If you read her work, you'll find references to Marxist scholars, psychoanalysts, French novelists, philosophers. The list kind of goes on. And the wealth of subject matter makes for a true odyssey of a read. Her most recent novel, Crocosmia, focuses on the relationship between a mother and daughter cast against a radical post-capitalist future. To quote the description of this novel on the Nightboat Books website, it is at once a fantasy, a handbook to political thought, and a work of eco-fiction, which truly speaks to the many hats Miranda can successfully wear as both an author and a thinker. In a recent interview, she posited, "What if every person, just by virtue of the perception of the future, has a hand in shaping it? What if we are all engaging in speculative fiction all the time?" Reflecting on my own work, the advice and education I've received from Miranda informs so much of my writing. I've explored literature as a tool for radical political imagination, and even now I'm doing letterpress work where I think very deeply about poetic structure on a letter-by-letter and line-by-line basis. She thinks deeply and critically about her work and larger systemic structures and has inspired me to do the same. To wrap this up, I'll simply say that being Miranda's student has been such a blessing, and her instruction has been nothing less than extremely generative and enriching. She's a brilliant writer and thinker, so it's with the utmost honor that I introduce Professor Miranda Mellis.
Thank you so much, Lincoln. That was the best introduction ever. Thank you. That was really thoughtful. So I have all these books here and no PowerPoint, so there. I wanted to start, I have a few touchstones for us today. I want to think about sensitivity together. I'm going to read from Crocosmia with an eye towards questions of sensitivity and the contemplative. And then I want to read from a manuscript I'm working on now, which is my next book, which is an expansion of a chapbook called The Revolutionary. And then I want to do some divination together, practicing a very ancient form of divination with books, bibliomancy. So that's why I have all these books here. So that's the plan, and then we can talk. So one of the ways that I've come to think about this novel, Crocosmia, that came out last August, and there's only so much you can know as you're composing, and then you keep learning about what your work is and what it means as it goes into the world and as you have conversations about it. And in some ways, I feel clearer about the ideas and the ideas that sort of structure this book now than I have a different set of ideas about it now than I had when I was writing it. And even still, more and more is emerging. And this art lecture series, it's such a, by the way, thank you, Shaw, for your curation and all your work, and Lucille as well. Can we just clap for them for a moment? Thank you. Thank you. It's such a special opportunity to be able to not just share your work, but kind of open up the process and the thinking behind it a little bit. And it's unusual to have that invitation to bring together these things. And so one sort of clear kind of idea that's emerged as I've been sharing this book and thinking about it is this idea of how it is working with what we can think of as a false divide in Western metaphysics between the contemplative and the active, and that this is kind of taken up and explored through the two main characters, who are Jane and Maya. Jane kind of occupying what we might call the active, the vita activa, and Maya kind of occupying the vita contemplativa, the contemplative. And how does that come to be? That's kind of one of the big, that's kind of the arc, in a way, of the story. But one of the things I'm thinking about with Maya is, and kind of more broadly, going from the particularity of this character to the generality of what we could call the contemplative, is that it is sensitivity, a kind of sensitivity that moves her in the direction of the contemplative. And this is just kind of coming into view for me. Like, I'm thinking about her mother, the character Jane, who is an activist and is active in the world as having also a kind of sensitivity, but who responds to those sensitivities differently. And, I was thinking about, like, in the plant world, the way that some plants, when they are encountering something that will eat them, some of them produce chemicals they create a kind of poison to poison that which would eat them. Some of them fold in, or fold up or withdraw. There are all these kind of, like, this range of responses to our kind of organismic sensitivity, right? That we might withdraw, that we might send out poison, that we might attack, that we might send out warnings. So some plants will send out warnings through their root system about something coming in to eat them. So I'm thinking about this continuum of sensitivities, and how Jane's sensitivity to omni-crisis, to world crisis, sends her into action, and Maya's sensitivities send her into contemplation. And then there's, like, the broader kind of sensitivity of art, or art as sensing, as sensation, or aesthesis, aesthetics, is etymologically, it's sense-making, right? Sense-making as in sensation, making sensation, producing sensory experience, and then sense making as in meaning making, or kind of engaging with symbolic orders. And this moment that Lincoln referenced in the introduction of kind of this question of like, what if everyone is engaging in speculative fiction, has something to do with this, right? That in some sense, like the question there is if we are all capable of kind of perceiving an emergent future, there's an aesthetic engagement that's always there in the core of that sensing, experiencing, and that making, or that labor of making. So aesthetics is kind of like all the way down, you could say, in this etymological sense, in this sense of aesthesis and sensing, the sensory, the sensorium, sensitivity. So let me read a little bit from this novel, and then with, that maybe a couple of people here have read it, and so it might feel a bit like, where are we, what's happening, because I'm reading from chapter 3. But I think you'll pick up on some of these themes, and then, you can kind of put together some of these ideas maybe with how you're hearing this story in this part of the book. Okay. The collective Maya and Jane had lived in for 7 years, between their time when Maya was an infant in the gray building, in the gray city, and their life together when she was a teenager in the artful bungalow in the lacy green wood before Jane's vanishment, was a syncretic breakaway convent with a windy old dining room, tall ceilings and windows, spacious rooms. It was called the Anarchstery of the Rosas, Parks, and Luxembourg. The buildings were airy, the floors creaked, the rooms were permeable. They had moved there at the invitation of the sisters, a collective of nuns, or as they like to call themselves variously, the nouns, the nuns, the no ones, noons, nines, though more usually just the Rosas, short for Sisters of Rosas, so that Jane could get help caring for Maya while she pursued studies in film, history, sociology, political economy, literature, and physics. The Noons ran a residential deconstruction company, which Jane helped with, and a small elementary school. The Rosas helped care for Maya while Jane attended classes. Dogs and cats also lived there, or at least were fed there, and they came and went of their own accord. Some more consistently than others. They were known by their looks and characters, but the Noons had not named them. Maya wanted to name them. One old German shepherd would occasionally be taken over by the desire to reenact his prior role as a guard dog, but he had no sense of who belonged and who didn't, as so many people came and went, sometimes staying for weeks or months, other times just for the night, trading a few hours of work for lodging. This dog would randomly start barking at whoever was in the same room. "Get out of here, get out!" He barked for a few minutes, and then, as if waking up from a dream, he brushed against the legs of whomever he had just been barking at and gave them an apologetic look. Maya named this dog Crazy. After Crazy got his name, he rarely barked anymore. Maya and Crazy stuck together. Occasionally, the aged dog would bark just once. This high-pitched, forceful shriek shattered anyone who happened to be nearby, though not Maya. Crazy's singular shriek rippled through her like a cloudburst, a silver crack of light. On her desk in her small room at the Anarchstery, Jane had her old childhood copy of Vladimir Mayakovsky's Hauer versus Maid, given to her by her mother and dedicated to Jane by Mayakovsky, after whom Maya was named. He had been a playwright, a poet, an artist, an actor, and a maker of children's books and posters. In A Cloud in Trousers, the street is a character who shoves pain along and coughs up its phlegm, while the poet proclaims his bodily mettle, His weather, he is pure raging meat, a sack of grisly meat, made of bronze with a heart lined with iron, not a man but a cloud in trousers. He did his cultural work. He warned the angels, "You winged fools, I'll slit you," and he threatened the Almighty, a jerk with a knife. "Heaven, get that hat off, here I come, for muscle and sinew work better than prayer, so I'll rip out my soul and stamp on it, make it big and hand it to you bloody for a flag." Wearing the thorny crown of revolution, he made public art to inculcate communist sensibilities during the Russian Civil War, but Mayakovsky was soon at odds with the revolutionary Russia he had helped write into being. He satirized it and was denounced in turn. Posthumously, he was celebrated by his enemy, the tyrant Stalin. Jane took to heart what Mayakovsky called the social command, the communist vocation, and obedience to the people, to the many, to the desires and objectives of your class. The social command concerns a problem, Mayakovsky wrote, the solution of which is conceivable only in poetic terms. Though she had never known the poet, she had been told by her Soviet mother, Hanna, that he was her progenitor, as she put it, in her impersonal way, from a single drunken night. Sometime after Mayakovsky killed himself, Hanna fled the country with her child. It took her years to get to Brooklyn, only to die of asthma when Jane was still a teenager, leaving her to fend for herself. Decades later, Jane repeated her mother's style of begetting, getting pregnant from one night's sex with a much older man she never saw again, a wanderer, a stranger she met at a train station. He said he was a computer scientist. He claimed to have invented the internet. He was voluble about the apocalypse and told her of a Mayan prophecy that the world would end. The Mayans, he said, called creation itself the framer, the shaper, and built galactic observatories to predict and represent the flows of time, the universe as an eternally changeful form. The shape master has abandoned us, he said. Her own intensity rose to greet his. She felt the same mad fear for the world. The world will end soon, he said, and his eyes filled with tears. My whole life has been an apocalypse. She told him no, the world was not ending soon. Rather, the world would begin again. There is a future, she said, and she knew it. He was moved by Jane, and she felt desire for him. Touching each other made them feel exquisite, hopeful. Later, he told her his backpack had been stolen with all his money. She gave him all her cash. He stayed on the train and she got off. He was going north to meet his agent, he said. She believed he meant it, even though she knew it wasn't a fact. They would see each other again, yet they made no plan to do so. She didn't know his last name, where he lived, how to find him. A month later, despite his age and hers, she found herself pregnant. She had had 4 abortions over her lifetime, but decided to keep this improbable baby. For years, she took the baby on the train they had been on the day they met, but she never saw him again. She named her baby Maya in honor of the prophecy the old man had taught her, and after the Vedic term for illusion, and after Vladimir Mayakovsky, Maya's alleged grandfather and tutelary spirit. The name told the child everything about who she was, where she was. Each Maya, within the proper named Maya, encountered another Maya that had nothing to do with the other. Yet something occurred between the 3 that didn't occur within any one of the Mayas, a conversation outside and between each one of them, just as she lived outside and between other lives in the strewn condition of the flying root, thrown, diasporic, seeking and never finding home. The proper name Jane held within it the genius of the begetting gene, not to mention the dedicated aspiration not to cause a single harm. The Jain nuns would wear masks so as not to accidentally inhale an insect, would gently sweep the ground in front of them not to step on one. Jane had been traveling when she encountered the older man. When she arrived at her destination, a coastal city in the western reaches of global patriarchal empire, she went through her pregnancy, gave birth in the free local general hospital, and raised her child, Maya, for the first 7 years. They had a 2-room apartment in a large apartment building near the beach. For much of the year, their gray building was encased in a matching gray fog so that it could sometimes disappear. It was surrounded by empty lots, so that the building itself, between the lots and the fog that crossed every line, blurred the horizon, seemed to exist like an island without connection to the rest of reality except the weedy plants, dandelions, fennels, pampas, and myriad other self-cultivating grasses and stalks, which grew up out of the crevices like the children who skateboarded, played ball games, and jumped rope in the afternoons and evenings until parents called them in from windows of diluted light. Even their clothes and faces seemed smudged by fog. When Jane saw a sign on the bulletin board in the lobby of their apartment building offering room, board, and childcare in exchange for part-time handiwork and gardening at the anarchistery of the Rosas Parks in Luxembourg, she immediately went there and inquired. She told them, "I can repair anything." In addition to recognizing her competency, the sisters also recognized Jane as a fellow witch. She and Maya joined the community. They made plans, ate cherries, drank coffee. Jane and Maya moved in, and it was as if they had been away after a long absence, as if they'd always been part of the community, and for the community, as if a missing piece had fallen into place. Everyone was happier, which meant their presence was needed. Needed for what? Enid wasn't sure yet. This called for divination. The no-ones had a practice of pre-admiration in which they admired in advance those they had not yet met. They had one central high-ceilinged structure with long, large windows surrounded by tall plants that was set aside for chants, where they practiced what they called a ministry of immanence. They called it the community living room. Nothing was planned there. Whoever arrived was welcomed as the no-ones venerated solidarity as an ethos within which free thought, free association, free will, and free love could flourish. If it weren't for their vestments and the fact that they lived at a convent or that they meditated and prayed for hours a day and spent their versatile days ministering to needs in versatile ways, using their spiritual imaginations to alleviate suffering, introducing children to experiential learning, and co-creating the possibility of collective happiness, it wouldn't have seemed like a religious order at all, insofar as no one gave or received orders, insofar as such orders had historically entailed the merging of life with rules a priori. In the rainy season, they laid out mats and bedding, and the anarchistery grew crowded with people of all ages and conditions seeking shelter from the cold. Enid Rosas, a visionary who co-founded the convent, had been a psychoanalyst until an illness led her to give up her practice and become a contemplative, after which her symptoms abated. She focused on writing and social care. She wrote a series of pamphlets deconstructing monotheism, When the Heavens Cease to Be Social, No One But an Old Nun, Little Orphan Anarchy, and others. It was Enid who asked, what genre are we living? Every genre is an organization of time. She proposed duration as their orientation to time, as time beings, days and nights that phase like the sky between songs, anecdotes, revelations, projects, plans, study, light and darkness. Now that she had help with raising her young daughter Maya, Jane had more time for her own pursuits while Maya attended the Nouns, a small school. It soon became apparent that although Maya didn't know many of the things other children her age knew, by the same token she did know things they did not know. She expressed her knowledge by means of drawings and paintings. She declared that she hated history and geography as source of tension with her baffled mother, for whom nothing was more important. It seemed to Maya that all the suffering which convulsed her mother relentlessly could be found under the same subjects. She, for her part, would defend the rights of the void, of timeless and spaceless zero, worldlessness. Enid recognized it. Back when Enid had a psychoanalytic practice, she would have called Maya's retreat a death drive. Now she saw it as the child's attempt to make shelter out of what her mother ignored. What didn't count for Jane was the nothing out of which Maya would try to make something, groundlessness on which she would try to construe a place to stand. The Noons had no mother superior. The pervasive figure of the Mother Superior had not been an alternative to patriarchal domination, but had masked and normalized its violence. The Mother Superior was a compensatory figural mother whose opposite number was the Mother Inferior, motherhood as the road to abjection and hunger, a cause of poverty, disrespect, isolation, sentimentally valorized by hypocritical churchmen. The Noons prayed and meditated individually and together. They practiced collaborative lucid dreaming to solve problems and make decisions, but they reversed the usual formula of dream interpretation, in which the dream is first remembered and then explicated. They made interpretations first and then had dreams out of their interpretations. It was after one of their collaborative dreams that they called Jane in from the grounds where she was planting trees and asked her to meet with them. They had made an interpretation about Jane and then set out to have a dream about her. In it, she had been swimming with a group of sharks, carrying a candle under water that somehow stayed lit. The sharks had allowed her to follow them. Holding her candle, Jane watched them hunt, shed thousands of teeth, and swim sleep on the ocean floor. The candle flame turned into a leaf, the candle into a branch. As the sharks slept, rocking their bodies gently side by side, their bodies turned to great green leaves, breathing and swaying, catching the light. Their teeth were leaves. The ocean became a forest. Enid offered the interpretation they wrote out before the dream, one form becoming another. She handwrote the interpretation for Jane on a piece of blue notepaper, which Jane folded up and kept for the rest of her life. Trappists made ale. The Noons grew milk thistle to be planted where plutonium was being detoxified. They made oyster mushroom mats to soak up oil spills that suffocated water. They manufactured chlorella formulas for cancer patients. Under the tutelage of the dream, Jane began experimenting with chlorophyll as a medium. She made anthotype prints out of flowers. Chlorophyll, Jane learned, is a detoxifier which filters out xenobiotics, strangers to life, such as phytates, dioxins, pesticides. Reflecting green light in photosynthesis or red light to dissipate heat and convert chemicals into vibration, sloughing excess energy on a diet of ultraviolet, binding to mercury, lead, nickel, and aluminum like a wrestler, chlorophyll embraced and devoured that which destroyed life, offering death to death on behalf of life. Okay, so I'm going to skip ahead a little bit. The kids are in class with the teachers, and Maya is becoming alienated from a friend who is starting to have different interests from her. And in response, Maya turned up a sound inside her head to drown it out. The sound got louder and louder on its own until one day she found she could not turn it off. All day and all night she heard this sound. Sometimes it comforted her, other times it tormented her. Cass never wanted to play anymore. Maya couldn't understand. She read books Maya couldn't understand. She wrote poems Maya couldn't understand. She talked about things that made Maya sad. So Maya was alone with the sound. After dinner one night, Maya asked Cass to play chess. Cass said no. Maya said, why? Cass said, because you don't listen to me. You pretend to listen to me, but you ignore me. Maya flushed, walked away. She went outside and walked aimlessly, not recognizing her surroundings, not knowing where she was going, until she saw an enormous willow tree. She crept under low curtaining branches that swept the ground, leaned against the trunk and cried. Then she lay down on her back. She heard the sound in her ears and thought, this sound helps me to ignore things, but what will help me ignore the sound? She began counting the leaves of the willow tree, and soon the sound went away, or she forgot about it. Her loneliness reemerged when the sound reappeared. It seemed to overflow like water searching for a limit, as if there was more of her than there used to be, all out of place. She needed to cut it off or pull it in, She pushed herself into the ground and then started covering herself with handfuls of soil. So, another scene with Maya. The children received instruction from Enid on how to travel without moving. They walked in silence, carrying pillows and blankets to a patch of forest. Under oak and manzanita, they each took a seat. They sat in silence for several hours, with occasional breaks, listening. After a while, Maya felt her consciousness in the tree canopy. She could feel her awareness in the leaves of the trees. She easily traveled in and through her awareness into the trees, wandering under rosy shadows. The brain seemed to have grown its axons and neurons in imitation of the trees, following their form. Up from the pituitary grew a stem and petals, opening and opening continuously. She felt that so many of the struggles of humanity might have to do with the evolutionary stage of this moment, and she thought, I'm waiting. We're all waiting, as if this whole world is some sort of waiting room. She felt impatient and got up and quietly wandered away. She chanced upon a turkey with 2 chicks making high-pitched and plaintive chirps, as if Maya thought to make sure they weren't left behind. We're here, we're over here. The parent turkey, so large compared to them, crunching through the grasses, seemed at once tentative and sure of herself. The sound of the turkeys as they disappeared in the grass rustled inside Maya's body. She saw yellow cloud bursts, and she suddenly felt inseparable from that sound. She was the sound the birds made as they rustled. A glimmer of joy shone through her body, a pure and simple happiness she had never felt before. This moment of becoming sound. After that, she wanted to be outside as much as possible, listening to animals, so that she could become sound again and feel herself pervaded by its light and its color. That night at dinner, Maya and Jane sat at a table with 3 of the oldest of the Noons. Maya was in a heightened state. She wanted to tell Cass and Jane about this, but they were at the other end of the table. They were discussing a book by Simone Weil on the abolition of all political parties. They talked about making the transition from elected authority to entrusted wisdom and egalitarian collective action, and lamented the superficiality of politics reduced to mere party ties. Maya listened and looked out the window at the changing light, as ephemeral as the shadows. Her elation began to subside. The objects outside sank away into indistinction, transformed into an indigo sky, the branches of trees like black etchings on a sphere of dark blue glass. Then she wondered out loud if trees go to sleep, if night is a relief for them, or if they waited for the sun, were eager for it. Enid commented they live their lives just as we do, first in the sun's light and then in the earth's shadow. Like us, they have evolved in companionship with these alterations of light and season. So this is early in the book, and then now I'm going to go towards close to the end. That is what I just read is like page 56 and 57, and now I'm going to page 123, and now I'm going to talk a little bit about this. Sometimes she stayed at the Anarchstery and did service there, helping with many projects that the No One spearheaded, and that allowed her to see Enid and Cass, but mostly Maya spent years, decades, largely in solitude in the clandestinity of private life. Silence after silence. The silence held numberless feelings, weather, languages, questions, memories, daydreams, reveries, sensations arising and passing away as she sat, thoughts like bubbles popping, like so many animals of every size and shape in their season. Some years she felt herself floating up to the sky on a golden pyramid, and everything shimmered for months on end. Other years she traveled without moving in the canopy or along the humming ground, sensing every root, every bird, every ant. She developed the capacity to feel beyond the strata of atmospheres, where gravity's field of play jumped scales. There she encountered planet organisms akin to relatives of Earth. Eventually, in her quiet sitting, she traveled through multidimensional realities far beyond the deep time of geological Earth, so much time folded into so many folds. When she was in her early 60s on a Tuesday, in her 10th hour of meditation, one of these lineations called to her, named Aster. A pulse went back and forth between herself on Earth and this not quite endlessly distant, but nearly indiscernible and subtle point where Aster listened. Maya prayed again for Jane to be alive and safe and to see her again before the end. To pray for this was to solve the past, the present, and the future all at once. She saw her own afterlife held in the safe hands of Aster, with whom she would merge in the end. She remembered Aster from a long ago dream as the being she had run towards for safekeeping while her mother did what she had to do, delaying Maya's birth with peacock flower tea and abortifacient. Although many had said that death was valueless, that it has not required us to keep a day free, Maya had come to see that it was not a question of value or non-value, of good or bad, but rather it is death that enabled star people to establish bonds with planetary travelers, the dead. Maya had learned from reading Jane's notebooks that she believed creation was not the work of a single creator, but the result of an ill-thought-out set of intentions, a game someone began to play and then abandoned, as if someone were to plant experimental seeds in experimental soil and then go on a trip, forgetting the whole thing, never to return. The creatures who were the content of the experiment now had to run the lab themselves. Politics was the question of whether to allow certain products of the experiment who were rancid with existential discontent to cause the whole thing to self-destruct, or to allow others in love with creation to realize its potential as an artwork. So that starts to then go into Jane, and the story just kind of weaves back and forth between them in time. It's a frame narrative that begins in a present moment of Maya remembering and then ends in a present moment of Maya remembering. But in between, we move through these various time frames and the point of view shifts between Maya and Jane. But I wanted to read those, so I read those parts at the beginning and end, first when Maya's a child and then when she's an old lady. Thinking about this arc of the kind of agony of human sensitivity, which is sort of what literature revolves around, I might say. What will characters do with it? But that in the beginning, that in the early part of her life as a child, that Maya's sensitivity is a recoil from these pains, and you might sort of think in some sense like, oh, too bad that she's going through this, right? She's later in the story, she's sort of, her mom disappears into a project. So she's left to her own devices. And this friend, and there's like all this loss. And what will she do with it? In the beginning, and it's like that, that kind of agonizing withdrawal. But then in that withdrawal, this sensitivity opens up onto something else, like this relation to the more than human world, right? The turkeys in the grass becomes a contemplative spiritual experience, right? She hears sound and she merges with sound, and it becomes color in her body as a result of this withdrawing. And that gives her a taste of something. It gives her a taste for something. And this novel is imagining the end of patriarchal warlordism. It imagines that we're drawing down carbon dioxide, that we are moving to egalitarian eco-socialism. It's sort of, this is what the sort of novel is about. It's a speculative fiction that tries to imagine this. And the ways that people live and exist are mostly revolve around and are centered on questions of ecological remediation, detoxification of toxic sites, all these kind of changes in the work regime, redistribution of labor rather than wealth, and the abolition of wealth, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But for Maya, she withdraws. And in this kind of imaginary, there's space for that. There's space for people to be contemplatives, but she also does her service. In any case, this taste for withdrawal begins in pain. It begins in this sensitivity. But then it turns into that end part, that I read from that one page where this thing is possible, that she is in solitude, that she is meditating outside, and that soon these things become possible for her to experience and sense that are otherwise not possible. To make contact with Aster, who's sitting right over there, and to have this memory of herself before she was conceived, and of her mother, of one of her mother's abortions, which is playing with this notion that I don't subscribe to per se, but I like as an idea that beings intend to be born or something like this. It's not to me a fact, but it is an interesting mythopoetic material to play with, for storytelling. This idea that these are the kinds of terrains that she can kind of make contact with because of the sensitization that she goes towards. So I think this is something that I'm just kind of discovering in this story. There's one other kind of page or two that I want to read from to talk about one other thing. Okay, so now we're with Jane. And Jane is because of living at the anarchstery, which brings together monastery with anarchy, anarchstery, and it's trying to be like a synthesis of like the best elements of kind of communal spiritual life with the autonomy and self-determination of the anarchic. And she's studying. One day, Jane was reading a letter at an outdoor table at the university cafeteria situated by a noisy thoroughfare. It was sent by Thomas Mann to Carl Karenyi in 1934. Mann wrote, "My moral critical conscience is in a state of constant exacerbation and is becoming more and more impossible for me to continue pursuing the, it may be, sublime game of novel writing until I have rendered an accounting and unburdened my heart of its concern, its perceptions, its pain, as well as its freight of hatred and contempt." Jane read the passage again and turned over in her mind the possibility of a sublime game of art that took the freight of hatred and contempt as material. What is hatred? She asked herself. Or who are the Furies? Just then, she distinctly heard an old woman cursing, bitter and quick, behind her. She felt her heart rock in her chest in fright. She turned just in time to see a child racing by on a skateboard, headphones on, singing. The child's voice had distorted on the wind and ventriloquized a raging old woman, unburdening her heart. And she, Jane, had felt it in her body. It wasn't intended for me, she thought, yet I received it anyway. It didn't happen, and yet it happened for me. This way that experiences, thoughts, and feelings had of hooking into each other and changing their prepositional positions, crossing as easily as light in, out, above, below, between, and despite bodies, was important somehow for her project. The body was indiscreet, permeable, riven with symptoms, warnings, and signs that came from all directions. The sense stores were utterly vulnerable. At one and the same time, a person is singing and cursing, young and old, from the perspective of the child who had never noticed her, whose altered voice had evoked such a reaction in her, she didn't even exist. The child was unreal, the old woman real. In some way, they were also one. She wrote in her notebook, worrying so much about our cause, but forgetting that we are causes, having effects that we are unaware of, and unconscious telekinetics. How can I wed this species of causality to that effect? Indiscernibility, anonymity, unknowability, the way a child could be the carrier of a generational curse without knowing it, used by ancestors to continue fighting their wars. Spirit, the untraceable, social commissions issuing from the dead. That day, Maya decided to surprise Jane on her lunch break between classes. She walked to the university. On her way to the cafeteria, she wandered into the student gallery and watched a video. In the video, hundreds of people danced wildly, furiously, quickly, thrashing, jumping, throwing their bodies around to slow, gentle, ambient music. Then the music and the dance changed. Now the dancers drifted like clouds, eyes closed, barely moving, almost floating, to loud, fast noise. She watched 2 cycles of the video and then went to the cafeteria where she saw Jane sitting at a corner table at the nearly empty end of a long courtyard with her back turned. As Maya approached, she heard Jane eating loudly, quickly turning the pages of an enormous book. She said, "Mom." Jane looked up blankly without recognition, and Maya saw momentarily an image in her mother's eyes of headless forms, a head cleaving from a body in jeweled red drips, like glittering sap along the side of a neck. In her mother's eyes, she sat down with a feeling of dread, felt herself out of breath. Jane put her hand on her daughter's back. Maya's throat ached and burned. She asked for water, and Jane went to get it. Maya held very still. If she moved or spoke a single word, she knew she would cry, and her cry would turn into a wail, which would bring back breath, but they were in a public place, and crying in public was still a scandal then, in that culture. In later years, if one person began to cry in the street, others paused to listen or cry alongside them. While her mother fetched water, Maya concentrated on the spines of the books on the table, reciting their titles to herself repeatedly until the air hunger melted away and she could breathe again. Over and over again, she read the titles silently, and as a result, she never forgot them. Psychic espionage, anomalous cognition, reading the enemy's mind, remote viewing, psychological warfare, the Rosalind Brodsky Research Program. Okay, so I did continue on there because I thought, well, let's have a moment of them together, in one of the moments of them together. Okay, I'm going to just pause with that. I'm realizing we just have about 10 minutes of this before we have conversation, which is the best part that I'm most looking forward to. I realized, I was sort of looking through various writings I've done over the years. I don't know, maybe this event or other things have made me do this. I haven't done it in a very, very long time. But I was rereading this story, The Quarry, which is in this chapbook, and I had sort of forgotten about it. It's from 2013. Beautiful art by this artist, Megan Vossler. Anyway, I'm like, what is this story, you know? And it's like totally about somebody like disappearing from their family. I'm like, okay. And then like, oh yeah, this is like about like a mother disappearing. It's just like over and over again, right? So it's just something to say, like, just to talk about creative work, you know? Like there's a way that maybe we do all sorts of things, or maybe we just keep circling around the same thing over, like Kandinsky with like St. George or whatever, you know, just doing the same painting over and over, or in different ways working through the same knot, you know, kind of iterating it. This book, Demystifications, is different from that, and I think it has something to do with the form. So it's not a narrative, it's like a bunch of aphorisms or like prose poems. And to speak about a kind of different process or a different making or a different composing experience. You know, I wrote this book, Demystifications. I had this very simple idea that whenever I had an experience or an encounter or an idea or a memory that had the quality of in some way seeming to demystify, to have that gesture in it, that I would write it down. And then over a long period of time, I just started accumulating these moments of, and you know, we could think about what demystification is, like it's, you know, like a Marxist term, but there's a lot of ways to think about it. But I had a very particular internal sense of what I meant by it, what it was for me. And then and then that's just what this became. So it doesn't then circle around this in this kind of recursive, like obsessive issue or contradiction or problem of sort of that Crocosmia circles around and other things I've written have. But I would say across all of these books, including, this is my first book, The Revisionist, which it came out in 2007, and I wrote in the wake of the Bush administration's decision to not sign on to the Kyoto Protocol, which was an agreement around climate. You know, like this is like 2001 or 2002 maybe, 2003, and this is like a pivotal, like horrific move. And also that around that time they start generating all this kind of junk science around climate change, right? Like they come out with this like 175-page report like that, like this is not real, climate change is not real, and then like these oil companies start using it, et cetera. So I had this idea to like write from the point of view of a person who understands very well what climate change is and how it works, but nonetheless is paid to lie about it and dissemble to the public. And I would write from that person's point of view as the narrator and try to kind of like enter into it, which allowed for a lot of things narratively, that what would happen to the person's perception who was splitting in this way. And it's, you know, it kind of just starts to deteriorate, you know, their ability to distinguish or to discern or to make distinctions just sort of slowly falls apart. So it's a little bit of a revenge story too. So anyway, these different kind of, and then the Spokes is set in an afterworld, and it is here again like this kind of, so with demystifications, that notion of the gesture of demystifications and kind of keeping an inventory of those. And then with the revisionist, just this one idea of like entering into the point of view of the enemy and seeing like what would happen to them or what they would say. And then with the Spokes, it's this fantasy of kind of going to this daughter character going to the afterworld to visit with their mother and ask her what happened and how she died. And so in this story, the dead like watch the dreams of the living as like a film festival. And that sort of like centers around, so there's a lot of like reference to visual art pieces and film in the story. And I think, so what I was just wanting to mention with regards to like, all of this is like these different uses of other texts, both in the lineage of documentary poetics and investigative poetics, Muriel Rukeyser, other poets who would use documentary evidence for their poems, which is this kind of move against lyric poetry that I, studied and learned a lot about early on in my life of learning literature and became interested in. And there's a sort of continuum of using other texts, right? We could think about like research, using evidence, using documents for poems or stories, all the way to chance, to kind of taking up texts in a chance way. And so this ancient practice of sorts Virgilianes, where, I think in the 1st century or something in the Roman Empire, people would take the Aeneid, so that's why it's called sorts Virgilianes, and they would open it at random, and whatever line they landed on, they would take as their oracle. So I wanted us to do this a little bit. So I have these books, and you can have the book So whoever wants to have a book but also wants to do a Sorts for Giuliani, here's some books. So come on up if you're interested. And we can do divination. And there might be enough for most people who are interested in that, and just grab whichever one. They're all like, the Encyclopedia Project is a book that it's a volume of a series of publications that I co-edited. That's the big book on the bottom that has visual art at the back. Yay. Feel a little bit like Oprah, like, and you get a book, and you get a book. So I'll just invite you right now, borrowing from C.A. Conrad's version of the Sorts for Giuliani's. C.A. Conrad's practice is you open and close the book 9 times. You can do it with your eyes closed or your eyes open. Open and close 9 times, and then that line is that's your divination. So I'll invite everyone to try that right now, who has a book. And then when you have landed on a line, I'll just invite a few volunteers to read the line. What did you find, Ghost? Do you want to read us the line?
Jazz, I'm going to tell you why.
What's the line?
Jazz, I'm going to tell you why.
Jazz, I'm going to tell you why. Is that a good divination for you?
I like jazz.
Okay. All right, let's have another. Yeah, there's someone over here who has a line to read, and up there, yeah. Okay, yeah, we can ride this into the Q&A.
Hello. The girl had a Swiss Army knife.
All right, does that speak to you? Yeah? Okay. We should all have a Swiss Army knife. Here's another line over here, right next to you there, Lucille.
I started the second one and moved to the fifth one. Sounds about right.
Nice. Sounds very orderly. Like there's orderliness is important today.
Everything you say will stay strictly between us.
Wow. Confidentiality. Something about confidentiality is important. Anyone else want to read? I see Gray's hand over there. And also Zoya. And also Quinn.
Its blue needle longed for magnetic north. Its metal case was concave in shape. The letters around its edges corresponded to one of the alphabets of Toulon.
Nice.
Maya opened her eyes with an ache in her neck, instantly forgetting her dream. Definitely, yeah, really to that one.
That speaking to you, Quinn? Instantly forgetting the dream. Cass?
We should make suicide pacts not to become them.
Ha! Whoa. Was that from Encyclopedia? Which entry was that? Hard to know.
Yeah.
A little obscure, maybe.
Author, I guess, I don't know. Yeah, K. Silim Mohammed.
Mm-hmm. Okay. How about you, Zoya?
Can I read 2? Because when I first opened it up, it was in italics, it said the hole in the noun, and I loved that. And then I did the 9 times, and I got, now the dancers drifted like clouds, eyes closed, barely moving.
Which is just from the part I just read. Yeah. Great. Well, thank you for reading those and for doing some divination together. And that part that I read from Crocosmia, where the nouns engage in this kind of divination, where they first, instead of having a dream and then interpreting the dream, they write an interpretation and then they have the dream, is it's funny, and it is to me a little bit of a way of thinking about speculative fiction, you know? Yeah, like imagine what, like write what the thing is or what you would want it to be, and then create the dream. In pedagogy, it's called backwards design. But something about that future anterior, that they're engaging in shaping or understanding themselves as historical agents that are creating, imagining and creating the present into the future, rather than trying to see what's around the corner, right? To have sort of a sense of like agency around what's coming around the corner. And we use the prophetic and divination and so forth. It's a mode of sensitization, and to go back to the beginning of the talk, you know, this kind of sensitivity to, sometimes we might, you know, in various times and places, people don't necessarily have other kinds of agency or power. And so there's a recourse to this mode of reading, of trying to read what's coming. Anyway, I will pause there and just open it up for questions and discussion. Yeah. Oh.
I noticed that throughout both your talk and through the first excerpts you were reading, you were using a lot of words and then like variations, either like through the like phonetic sound of it, or through like roots, or like Mayan, Mayakovsky sense, like to have senses to make sense of nuns, nouns. And I was wondering where that impulse in like craft kind of comes from. I kind of reminded me of like in Freud's Uncanny, when he's doing the like definitions and etymology of like Heimlich and Unheimlich, and yeah, I wanted to know, first of all, if there's like a source of inspiration, and second of all, what it does for you when you're in process.
Thank you so much for that beautiful question. Yeah, I started out as a poet for many, many years. I really came to writing narrative and stories much later. And I was, you know, this would kind of obsessively rewrite like single lines or phrases, and really like always looking for, you know, like wordplay, but also like sometimes like revising and distilling so much a piece of writing that there would be like almost nothing left, you know. Just be like, now we're back to the blank page. Ah, perfect, you know. So I had a lot of years of kind of just being really focused in on the music of words and the materiality of language, and the kind of the sonic and the rhythmic and the metric and the associative. And then I kind of, at a certain point, I became curious about why people write stories and what is that impulse. And I took a workshop with Ricky Ducournay, a weekend fiction writing workshop, just like as a kind of like skeptical outsider, like, what are you people? And part of what I realized I was didn't understand about that impulse was like, how would you choose among the infinite number of possible narratives? What would you choose to write your story about? Where like there was something about language play, or my kind of interest or love of language, and taking a single word and opening it up and seeing what its different valences and histories, that there's so many stories within kind of each word, right? The story of the word itself. And in that workshop, I sort of playing with, you know, this kind of problem of infinite potential narratives. I wrote a piece that was this was such a long time ago, God, like 25 years ago or something. I wrote a piece that was sort of imagining different times of day throughout a 24-hour period, like 10:17 and 3:09 or whatever, and then I would put a line that would just be like the potential first line of a potential story, and then put all these things together, in a circle, like, okay, here, so what, all these things, all these millions of possible, and then, so I was sort of doing it as a little bit of, I called it like novellas by the hour or something like that, and, but then I became interested in those lines, and particularly I became interested in kind of the emergence of character, or the possibility of the psyche of a character, and like what would start to form around a character, and what could start to emerge, and then interactions between characters. And that's when I started to sort of get to move into that. But I never left behind this kind of interest in language itself as material, and its kind of opacity when you leave behind its semantics and its musicality, and also when you really dive into its different valences to sort of see the mutability of language and the changeability of it, how it just constantly changes, its branching patterns, yeah. I don't know if that, I hope that answers, yeah.
Hi, I'm curious about your work with dreams. You mentioned in the reading this sort of collective dreaming, and being your student before, we've talked about collective dreaming before, and I'm interested in like the sort of use of condensation and displacement, and where that fits into how you view speculative fiction and sort of the sensitivity of dreaming, and especially if you're doing it with other people, and sort of, I'm curious about how that informs your ways of writing speculative fiction.
Right, nice. So Quinn just referenced condensation and displacement, which are psychoanalytic terms that describe, on the one hand, a dream image that, displacement we can think of in relation to metonymy, and condensation in relation to metaphor. And I feel like metonymy is certainly very important. Metonymic progression is part of what can hold a story together. But what really interests me about your question is the collectivity part. Because the idea of collective dreaming, or collective lucid dreaming, or it suggests, like one of the things that psychoanalysis tells us about metonymy, it is like how particular the metonymy of a single person's psyche would be based on their experiences, particularly in that, way of working with the mind, early experiences, that where things get linked up unconsciously, associations get linked up in the psyche, and that those then in the free association, in the giving of the history and the telling of the story, those linkages start to kind of become perceptible or more apparent. Oh, I associate this with that. And the somatization around that can maybe start to subside. At least this is the hope, right? Or the kind of wager of the free association, especially with dream work, that if there's symptoms that are connected to these early linkings and they can be delinked through being surfaced and through the dream interpretation, then the symptoms might subside or something like this. I mean, this is a little overdetermined, but so then what your question suggests or raises as I think is part of like what the kind of ambition of the anarchsteries dreaming together is, and people have historically in many cultures and times done dream work together to make decisions or to understand conditions, or to find things they need and so forth, is how these kind of patterns of dreaming, where is it shared, right? There's a book that I'm forgetting the name of that came out recently of a recovery of somebody who had been interviewing people about their dreams right before, like, Hitler came to power. Do you remember the name of this book? It just came out. Ghost, do you remember it? No. Anyway, it's this collection, and you see these patterns, people are having similar dreams as they're starting to ascertain something that's coming. And it's this, so I think there's, but then again, that is also that kind of like, it's anticipatory. There's the prescience, or the kind of the foreknowing, that where the unconscious seems to know things or hold kinds of knowledge that the conscious mind doesn't have access to. And so it seems there's a lot of promise or potential to understand things in a jump scales through doing that together, and not just, alone in the clinic, like unpacking your own particular, like, parental neuroses or whatever. It seems like it could be. There's a lot, and then there's like a history, and maybe Shaw could speak to this more, of in social practice art, of something called institutional dreaming. And Cassie Thornton is an artist that I know many of you are familiar with, who has done this work with people going to particular institutions where there's certain kinds of institutional problems going on, and sleeping there, and then dreaming together about how to work on that problem as an art project that is also a political organizing, like a form of political organizing. Yeah. See Ghost's hand. Yeah.
Hello. So I'm like halfway through Crocosmia, so you can just tell me to buzz off and finish it. But one of the quotes that you used was one that I actually had a question about prior. It's like a list of things that Jane wants for Maya to be able to study, and it's very reminiscent of like a quote that John Adams used in one of his letters, talking about like, I study war so that my children can study physics and such and such and such and such, and porcelain is my favorite one. But he like keeps going down this list, and the more that I'm reading, like looking at quotes about the like great turning had to be helped along with thoughts without thinkers, acts without actors, and how the fictive would emerge from the real, as it always did. Jane seems to, like, in reference to John Adams, like, she seems to, through the story, like with Ovid, seems to use war as study. And I was kind of wondering if you could speak to, like the subversive nature of of all of that, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
I hope that helps.
Yeah, I love that question. Jane is creating a work of art that requires learning a whole bunch of different things, and it begins with that moment I read from about the kind of anthotypes and like working with chlorophyll. That's the very beginning of it. And then she needs to study a bunch of things in order to make this film that she makes. And she is imagining, and she makes this film, which is sort of, in a way, a central image of the whole story, which is that there's this imagining of the end of these heads of state. And that it's like a holistic, it's political, but it's also ecological, because there's a whole kind of notion of decay as muse, and that's, this ecofictive kind of idea where these people who hold on to power are correlated in a way with objects in the ecosystem that won't biodegrade, and then torque the whole system around that toxic inability to decay. And so then decay becomes, is proposed in the story as like a muse that we should honor, the decay of objects that move back into the stream of change, and the decay of forms of tyrannical power. Like that, what tyranny is this holding on to power, right, and domination. And so she imagines this almost like recycling of these heads of state, as you know from having been reading the book, like where their heads are, like the head is a metaphor, but it's also like, it's like the heads of state, but it's also like capita, the root of, back to etymologies, the root of capitalism, capita, heads of cattle. So the decapita is to decapitate the head of capital. And so there's like, all this kind of thinking about all of that, and then imagining it, and then making the film. And then the part of the kind of like all the list of titles that Maya memorizes as she tries to downregulate, self-regulate herself by just looking at the titles and memorizing them so she can like calm herself because of what she's just seen in her mother's eyes, is that all those books have to do with like this notion of the telekinetic, and that she's like trying to make a work of art that would actually like do what, and this is kind of playing with these ideas of how representations act on the real, as well as do this kind of science fiction thing of imagining like remote action at a distance, as like an art form or something. Spooky action at a distance, as Einstein put it. And that in her conception of things, which is later revealed as a shared project among many, which is a little bit of a spoiler for you, but Maya doesn't know that, Maya doesn't know that, but later she finds out that it's actually a big, even though Jane seems to have been acting alone, that actually there's a lot of people involved with all these things. That there's something about both enacting like the actual and the symbolic at the same time, or like understanding the symbolic as having an enacting power. And that it's conceptualized as self-defense, right? Self-defense for the environment, self-defense for the future, self-defense, et cetera. And there's a distinction there, between the kind of violence of domination and appropriation and expropriation and self-defense. These are different things. Yeah. I don't know. Does that help? Yeah. Yeah. Any other questions?
Especially with speculative fiction, I almost see the generating of the story as an intentional kind of dream making, especially with using language and representation and like making meaning from that by just, association and tying those details together. And I almost see your characters as representations of like philosophical viewpoints or responses to the state of the world. And I read the book and I felt like it was almost like teaching us about these things, about the power of language and representation. And I was curious how you balance in the art of generating the story, that process of piecing together those moralist points with, like, I guess, generating the dream and imagining and then refining that to details and story points and words and lines.
Yeah, it's good to see you. Are you asking about the interplay between maybe what we could call the pedagogy of the book and the like storytelling or dreamlike or narrative aspects?
Yeah, I'd say balancing where you're making decisions and dreaming and generating ideas. And riding that line between creating the story.
Okay, yeah. this is like such a crux question that is the kind of art of revision, I think, and of working between a kind of the technical decisions and the unconscious, or the kind of, as you're putting it, the dreaming part, where we don't necessarily know or need to know where this diction is coming from, this image, we might have like a whole bunch of intentions we're bringing, or as I was saying, maybe even just one, right? One idea, probably a question, most generatively, some kind of question or sense of impasse or contradiction that's like not resolvable, like it just is like endlessly not resolvable, or that we're sitting with and working with, and then giving to the text, giving to characters maybe. And so we have all that. And then the question is like, if we're coming to the page and we're not working on a text that is more or less trying to like make an argument, or explore an idea theoretically or historically, but we're actually trying to make a story out of it, then I think we have to let in a lot more not knowing, and a lot more of kind of the, if we say that there's the mind that's like calculating and analyzing and figuring out and directing and so on in our life, like it's such and such time, we've got it, and then there's this other intuitive, I don't mean to overdetermine this, I'm not a like brain scientist or something, but like, that there's something in us that can know things, and that things can arise for that is not not a logic, a logical knowing, and that we bring those things together in what we call, poetic logic, right? A kind of poetic logic or a dream logic, and it means sort of, and then there are the demands of the story, like how you're tacking things down. Like I had to, at some point, if I was imagining this as a near future, I needed to make a timeline and really wrestle with the question of, if I'm imagining historical change, I have to, even though I'm in this kind of sort of metaphorical, allegorical space, what I want for the book to do means I need to think about historical time. And so I have to kind of like think about how old anybody is and when something happens and how, and that means like that line, And so I think you kind of tack between those things, that kind of like, here's a whole, like, I don't know, I'm like people think sometimes the writer is like an amanuensis, like the secretary, like I'm just kind of like the amanuensis for these characters, like the no ones and Enid and so forth are kind of like, they're going to do this interpretation and they're going to have this dream, and I'm like, okay, what is it? Oh, it's these sharks, and at first I don't understand, a flame stays lit underwater. We dream like this every single night, right? So we have so much access to this, okay, but I don't know exactly what it means. And then over time, and at first it's this really long interpretation that I have to write out and think through, and has to do with that community and her and what they're doing together. And then it just comes down finally to one line, one form changing into another, as like what this community understands her role to be, to be involved with metamorphosis, social metamorphosis. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, you're so welcome. I think we have time for one more. Yeah.
You talked about the idea of like someone being chosen to be born and like kind of predetermining their life in that way. I was wondering like where that inspiration came from and how you kind of came to that idea. Like it seems very connected to your exploration of like time and narrative. But,
yeah. Yeah. And again, I'll just reiterate, this is not like a belief I subscribe to, but I grew up in San Francisco in the, and I grew up around, a lot of how do you even characterize it? Like where I would have picked that up, I don't know, but I have always had friends who have these ideas.
Is it related to anthroposophy and Rudolf Steiner?
It might be related to anthroposophy. It might be related to ideas about reincarnation. And I think, I wonder, it's like one of like this kind of reservoir of these kinds of ideas that they sort of have something to them, and there's something interesting about it, and as a fiction writer, I don't need to like decide, like I don't need to like put my foot down, like I believe this or don't believe it, I can just use it, but I wish I could answer that question better, like where that maybe other people know, like where this idea comes from of like the notion of choosing, like there's a kind of, the reason that I keep saying like I don't subscribe to this is because I think there's obviously something incredibly problematic about the idea that one might have, like there's a punishing aspect to the new age, you chose your fucked up parents, it's like, what? And so we have to be sort of, like careful about these typologies and these kind of like over-determined like systems of that kind of fix us in some way into some kind of, it's like Walter Benjamin has this idea, he writes about this, he calls it weak messianism, and it can be contrasted with like strong messianism. Weak messianism, as he describes it, is like there's possibility, not there's inevitability. Strong messianism is like, we need to destroy the world so the Messiah comes, you know what I mean? Like, it's like this certainty, like we believe this thing and that's, and there's a figure and it's this messianic, as opposed to messianism as a distributed attunement to possibility, to emergent possibility. And that is playful and open and I think ethical and relational. So when Maya has that memory, I hope that the way it's written is not that, oh, now I understand everything about the world and myself and this, but it's more like it's like this kind of, it's like the metonymic that Quinn was bringing up. It's like there's a metonymic progression. There's a relation between this kind of imaginary of the star people and what she can make contact with that is part of the human sensorium and of contemplative experience of people who spend time in solitude and silence, who start to have experiences that are not otherwise available, that don't have to turn into belief systems, that can stay in the not knowing. Yeah, I hope that answers. Yeah, thank you. Thank you, everyone.